Commerce Alive Today presents
Midway Airlines. Midway Airport, 11 miles from downtown Chicago, had been the world's busiest before the major airlines relocated to the newer, more remote O'Hare International. Irving T. Tague founded Midway Airlines Incorporated in 1976 along the lines of Southwest Airlines, the upstart that had won many hearts from its home at Tiny Love Field near Dallas. Employing a staff of 200, Midway began flying on November 1, 1979, linking Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, and Kansas City with 3 McDonnell Douglas DC-9 jets. The red lips of Midway's billboards and print ads bade locals to kiss O'Hare goodbye. Cut-rate fares, sometimes one-third those of competitors, sweetened the offer. Midway thrived in the deregulated environment and came to totally dominate Midway Airport. In 1984, Midway acquired Bankrupt Air Florida Incorporated and its 3 Boeing 737s. It dropped most of its routes, however, which were more geared toward leisure travelers. In Midway's Metrolink experiment, the carrier installed business-class seating, 4 seats across, throughout its DC-9s. Passengers did not flock to the idea in sufficient numbers, however, and the company reverted to the industry standard, 5 across rows. Midway lost $37 million in 1984 and 1985. Chairman Arthur C. Bass was ushered out, and David Henson was tapped as his replacement in February 1985. Henson, a former Navy fighter pilot, had joined the airline as an investor in 1978 after a career at United Airlines, Northwest Airlines, and Hughes Air West, under Tague. He soon restored the carrier to profitability by cutting costs and refining schedules, using Chicago as a hub. He also sold a couple of planes and increased daily utilization on the remaining DC-9s and 737s while reducing labor expenses. Midway looked west for new opportunities and developed more of the low-fare, leisure traffic previous managers eschewed. The company bought commuter carrier Fisher Brothers Aviation for its feeder traffic. Cooperative agreements also were penned with Canadian Airlines, Varig Brazil, and Air New Zealand. Traffic grew by more than 30% a year in the mid-1980s. By 1986, Midway was the 14th largest U.S. airline with revenues of $261.4 million. Employment reached 3,000. Originally devoted to used planes, Midway switched to new models in the name of fuel economy. 5 new Boeing 737s were brought online in 1986 and soon after Midway ordered 8 new McDonnell Douglas MD-87s. Revenues reached $412 million in 1988. Aggressive expansion 8 new cities, however, was accompanied by a drop in profits to $6.8 million. Henson ordered 37 MD-80 jets worth $900 million in March 1989 as Midway began flying and advertising coast to coast. It won a bid for assets of Eastern Airlines including its Philadelphia hub, 2 Canadian routes, and 16 DC-9s after government regulators blocked its sale to U.S. Air. Although measured growth had always been Henson's mantra, overexpansion on the East Coast helped bring Midway to the ground. Recession, high fuel costs, and price competition with Eastern prevented Midway from ever capitalizing on the Philadelphia hub. Henson hired Thomas E. Schick, formerly of U.S. Air, to help Midway survive in the summer of 1990, cutting jobs and winning concessions from suppliers. Midway sold its newly purchased slots at New York and Washington for leaseback and sold its Philadelphia hub to U.S. Air for $65 million. However, this was not enough to satisfy creditors, and the company filed bankruptcy in late May 1991. Midway had grown its fleet from 3 to 44 aircraft and had never had a fatal crash. Northwest Airlines agreed to hire most of Midway's 4,300 former employees after outbidding Southwest for Midway's assets, for which it agreed to pay about $170 million. Northwest canceled the deal, however, after purchasing Midway's gate assignments, which some viewed as a defensive move to ward off competition from Southwest. Midway finally ceased operations after Northwest dropped out of its buyout deal. Northwest blamed the deal's failure on inaccurate reporting by Midway and a newly discovered leaky fuel tank at its hangars. Its defense prevailed in later lawsuits. Meanwhile, Southwest Airlines moved into the void created at Midway Airport, hiring more than 400 former Midway Airlines employees. David Henson went on to head the Federal Aviation Administration. Jet Express Incorporated, incorporated in 1983, took the name Midway Airlines Corporation in November 1993. The new investment group assembled $251 million in startup capital. Fokker, the Holland-based aircraft manufacturer, was among the investors, and the new company's business plan rested on the wings of 8 new Fokker 100 jets. The Midway name took to the skies again on 2 of the Fokkers in November 1993. It was staffed by 150 employees, most alumni of the original Midway. Kenneth T. Carlson, the new president, had been one of the original Midway's founders before starting New York Air in 1980. The company contracted with American Airlines for maintenance. Midway's relationship with American extended to frequent flyer miles and access to the Sabre computer reservation system. Initial traffic was brisk. Nevertheless, the company lost $11 million in its first year and a half of operations. The Zell/Chilmark Fund LP, led by Sam Zell, bought 90% of Midway Airlines for $25 million in July 1994. President John Salvaggio, a former American Airlines executive, was hired by new chairman Jerry Jacob, also formerly with American. In March 1995, the new management relocated the company to Raleigh-Durham Airport, in the heart of North Carolina's Research Triangle, which recently had been vacated by American Airlines. The name still fit, according to company representatives, since it was now based midway between North and South. After the transfer, Midway drew comparisons to Frontier Airlines, a West Coast airline of similar size and strategy that also had taken over an old American Airlines hub. Although Delta Air Lines and U.S. Air had well-established hubs in Atlanta and Charlotte, respectively, 2 other low-fare carriers also competed on Midway's turf, Columbia, South Carolina-based Air South, which did not survive very long, and ValueJet, later AirTran, based in Atlanta. The latter flew to 2 of Midway's largest markets, Boston and Orlando. After moving to Raleigh, Midway ditched the no-frills philosophy of Southwest Airlines. The post-RDU Midway offered better amenities than other low-cost carriers but at a premium, pitching itself as an upscale carrier. Part of the gutsy play to bring Midway back into relevancy was an order for 4 new $45 million Airbus A320 jets, a bit larger than the Fokker 100s that made up its existing fleet, for ventures into the Caribbean. Midway carried 1.2 million passengers in 1995. Employment increased to 1,100 since the move to RDU. The winter of 1995-96 was a trying one, however. Many pilots were furloughed and Midway had to restructure payments on its leased Fokkers. Fortunately for Midway, the bankruptcy of the Dutch manufacturer helped drive lease payments down on this model. The Caribbean gamble did not pay off, however, and Midway ended up returning all but one of the A320 jets in 1996. Nevertheless, good traffic on Cancun and Las Vegas routes justified keeping the last one. Other unprofitable routes were cut. Midway still planned to expand its offerings in the northeastern United States, however. It also sought to boost its customer service, appealing to businesswomen, for example, by designating 1 lavatory aboard each flight for females only. In spite of the trying winter, Midway ended up losing $8 million for the year. Executives were preparing for an initial public offering. They aimed for Midway to triple in size by century's end. The company raised $20 million from 2 investors, allowing it to buy a few more new planes to take over the Raleigh-Atlanta route that ValueJet abandoned to Delta Air Lines after its disastrous Everglades crash. Midway blamed its commuter partner, Midway Connection, for a sudden cessation of services related to FAA violations in 1997. Midway Airlines subsequently switched to Corporate Airlines, which operated small 19-passenger British Aerospace Jetstream 32 aircraft as a commuter affiliate. It ordered 10 Canadair regional jets from Bombardier in November 1997. Midway went public the next month on the Nasdaq Stock Exchange. Donald Burr, People Express founder, led a bid to buy Midway for $37 million. He planned to move the carrier to New York. In 1999, 2 investors, James H. Goodnight and John P. Saul, launched an unsuccessful takeover attempt after amassing 47% of company stock. They had offered $36 million for the rest of the company. In March 1999, Southwest Airlines announced plans to serve Raleigh while U.S. Airways provided low-cost competition in the form of its MetroJet unit. Other unpleasant news for Midway's managers came when the carrier's flight attendants became unionized. Midway ordered 15 new Boeing 737s in June 1999 to complement its smaller Fokker 100s and regional jets. By this time, the airline dominated Raleigh-Durham Airport the way its namesake once had at Midway Airport. Traffic was lackluster in 1999, although it did peak at the end. Midway carried 2.1 million people during the year. Profits fell to $9.4 million from 1998's $15 million, although revenues were up 3% to $218 million. The winter of 1999 to 2000 saw Midway increase its flight frequencies. The high-tech slump of 2001, as well as the commencement of operations at RDU by low-cost carrier Southwest Airlines, hurt Midway, and the carrier filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on the evening of August 13, 2001. Thousands of employees were laid off immediately. Increasingly relying on the higher seating capacity of the 737-700S, Midway continued to fly during reorganization, but after the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, Midway never restarted operations after airspace was shut down, and ceased operations on September 12. The last flights were on the morning of September 11. Following $12.5 million in financial infusion from the U.S. federal government, Midway resumed service using their fleet of 12 Boeing 737-700 aircraft from RDU under its own livery on December 19, 2001. It continued this service until U.S. Airways offered to have Midway fly regional jets as U.S. Airways Express. On July 17, 2002, Midway once again abruptly discontinued service and disposed of its fleet of 737s and again laid off all employees. They remained closed until February 2003. At that time, they commenced operations as U.S. Airways Express, with limited service offered from hubs in both RDU and Washington Reagan National Airport. They operated with 6 regional CRJ-100s serving East Coast cities and some Midwest destinations. It finally ceased operations on October 30, 2003, through a Chapter 7 bankruptcy when it was unable to acquire enough capital to stay afloat despite a private equity firm's infusion during the course of Midway's history. The same private equity firm Wexford Capital eventually became involved with Republic Airways Holdings after disposing of its interests in Midway Airlines along with National Airlines after the 9/11 terrorist attack, which affected the airline industry so drastically.
Hey, Coach Ditka.
Yeah?
You going to Florida?
You bet. Even a coach needs a day in the sun.
I'm gonna go fishing.
I'm gonna play those great Florida golf courses.
You any good?
I got a little problem with
Maybe
that.
you should go fishing.
Midway flies non-stop to more Florida cities than anybody.
Midway, our spirit will lift you.
What do you want to be when you grow up?
A quarterback.
You too.
If you have any fond memories, please indicate it at the comments below. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and like.